The leather notebook lay open on the vanity, its creamy pages stark under the unforgiving dressing room lights. From the doorway, my breath hitched, a sharp, silent intake of air that burned my lungs. I had left it there. My private creative journal, the one place where I allowed myself to be completely unguarded, was exposed. And someone was reading it. Nadia stood over my station, her back to me, the stillness in her posture terrifyingly absolute. That page didn't just contain random thoughts. It detailed a specific writing exercise about forbidden workplace dynamics. And she was the subject. She turned slowly, her reflection catching my eye in the mirror, her expression unreadable. To understand the sheer, suffocating weight of that moment, you have to understand the room we had been sharing for 6 weeks. The theater was a converted warehouse in the city's industrial district, a space that always smelled faintly of sawdust, old velvet, and the humidity of a rainy October. Dust motes danced in the stage lights like suspended time, and the air was perpetually thick, heavy with the pressure of a looming opening night. We were weeks away from the premiere of a high-stakes 2-woman play, a production that demanded everything we had, and we were failing to give it. Nadia was the reason, or at least that's what I told myself. She was a visceral, instinctual actress, the kind who didn't memorize lines so much as absorb them into her bloodstream. When she moved on stage, it was fluid, unpredictable, a raw nerve exposed to the audience. I was technical, a creature of control and precise blocking. I built a performance like an architect. She summoned hers like a storm. We existed in a state of suspended Cold War, a stillness louder than any line we spoke. Our interactions were a masterclass in professional distance. We exchanged polite nods in the hallway, retreated to separate corners during breaks, and spoke only when the script demanded it. It was exhausting, this constant effort to maintain a neutral perimeter. I would watch her from across the green room, noting the way she sprawled on the couch, taking up space with an arrogance that made my teeth ache, while I sat upright, script in hand, preserving my energy. We were cast as lovers, 2 women entangled in a complex, devastating romance. Yet the air between us offstage was cold enough to crack glass. The irony wasn't lost on the crew. We were supposed to be portraying a connection that defied logic, a magnetic pull that ruined lives. But every time we stepped into the rehearsal space, the energy died. It was like trying to start a fire with wet wood. The director, a man with more vision than patience, was losing his mind. "It's mechanical," he had shouted just that morning, throwing his hands up. "I'm seeing the gears turn. Where is the heat? Where is the risk?" He was right. The intimacy scenes were stiff, a series of choreographed movements rather than a genuine exchange. I would reach for her, and my hand would stop an inch too soon, or her gaze would slide past my ear instead of meeting my eyes. We were pushing against each other with invisible, stubborn force. What no one knew, not the director, and certainly not Nadia, was that my silence wasn't born of indifference. It was a dam holding back a flood. To cope with the stifling repression of my daily life, the expectations of my conservative upbringing, the pressure to be the good one, the perfect professional, I wrote. Writing was my release valve, my shadow self. It was the one place where I didn't have to be technical or controlled. While Nadia paced the wings or smoked outside in the rain, I would find a quiet corner and bleed ink onto paper. Stories about longing, about the terrifying thrill of losing control, about the very things I refused to let show on my face. I didn't know then that she did the same. I didn't know that she had her own notebooks filled with scrawled poetry about displacement and belonging, hidden in her bag, just like mine. I only knew that the tension between us felt untenable. That afternoon had been particularly brutal. We had run the Act 2 reconciliation scene 4 times, and each time it had felt flatter, falser. The humidity in the theater was oppressive, making my shirt stick to my back. Nadia had looked bored, her eyes glazed over as she delivered a line that was supposed to shatter my heart. The director finally cut the scene, rubbing his temples in frustration. "Take 20, he snapped, not even looking at us. "Find the heat, or we're cutting the scene entirely." Frustrated, humiliated, and vibrating with unspent energy, I had retreated to the dressing room, opened my notebook, and let the dam break. I sat at the vanity, shoving a pile of damp makeup wipes and half-empty water bottles aside to clear a small, sacred space in the chaos. My journal was heavy, the leather cover worn soft from years of being shoved into rehearsal bags and hidden under pillows. Opening it felt like opening a window in a room that had run out of oxygen. For me, writing was a survival mechanism, a way to siphon off the excess pressure of a life spent carefully coloring inside the lines. I came from a background where composure was currency. You didn't scream, you wrote. That afternoon, the frustration with the scene, and with Nadia, was vibrating under my skin like a trapped hornet. I uncapped my pen, the click sounding satisfyingly sharp in the empty room. I didn't plan what to write. I just let the ink hit the paper, scratching out a prompt I had been avoiding for weeks. The things you want but cannot ask for. It was a dangerous prompt. It was the kind of question that stripped away the professional veneer I worked so hard to maintain. But the words came rushing out faster than I could self-edit, flowing with a terrifying fluid ease that my acting had been missing for weeks. I didn't write about fame or a standing ovation. I didn't write about the director finally approving of my technique. I wrote about her. The list wasn't graphic. It wasn't a recounting of physical acts, but something far more intimate and, consequently, far more embarrassing. I wrote about the specific architecture of the tension between us. I wrote, "I want the moment where she drops the act. I want to see the exhaustion she hides behind that arrogant posture, and I want to be the one she doesn't feel the need to hide it from." The pen scratched louder as I pressed harder. I want her to fix my collar not because it's in the blocking, but because she can't stand the distance. I described the sensory details I had been pretending to ignore. The scent of tea tree oil she wore that seemed to cut through the stale theater air. The way her voice dropped an octave when she was truly angry. A sound that made my stomach flip in a way that had nothing to do with professional rivalry. As the list grew, the lie I had been telling myself began to dissolve. I stared at the words, the loops of my handwriting betraying the truth I had masked with cold politeness. I didn't hate Nadia. I wasn't annoyed by her visceral, messy talent. I was envious of it, yes, but more than that, I was drawn to it. My rivalry was a fortress, a necessary structure to contain a profound, terrifying attraction to her unapologetic presence. She took up space I was afraid to occupy. She felt things I was afraid to name. The friction between us wasn't a lack of chemistry. It was an excess of it, a charge so high I had to ground it out with hostility, just to function. I was in the middle of a sentence, the ink wet and glistening under the vanity lights, when the stage manager's voice boomed over the intercom, crackling with static and urgency. 5 minutes to places. We're running the argument scene from the top. Let's go, people. Panic spiked in my chest. 5 minutes was nothing. I scrambled up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, adrenaline flooding my system. I grabbed my water bottle, checked my hair in the mirror with a frantic, cursory glance, and turned toward the door. In the rush, the singular, fatal error happened. I didn't close the book. I left it lying flat on the white laminate of the shared vanity, the pages exposed, the ink barely dry on the final, damning line I had just carved into the paper. I want her to stop acting and actually look at me. I was halfway down the hall before I realized what I had done. And by then, the silence in the dressing room was already waiting for an audience. I made it back to the dressing room in record time, my heart hammering against my ribs like a bird trying to break a cage. I didn't just walk. I practically slid into the doorframe, my hand gripping the wood for stability as I swung myself into the room. I expected to find the room empty, or perhaps to see a stagehand clearing the trash. I prayed for emptiness. I bargained with the universe for a closed book. But the universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor, and it was currently sitting in the silence of that dressing room. Nadia was there. She wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't fixing her hair. She was standing over my station, her posture perfectly erect, her hands resting on the edge of the vanity table. The notebook was still open, and she was reading. The air in the room felt suddenly vacuum-sealed. All the oxygen had been sucked out, replaced by a thick, static tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. I should have spoken. I should have marched over there, slammed the book shut, and demanded she respect my privacy. I should have played the role of the offended colleague. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the specific quality of her attention. She was reading my vulnerability with the same surgical intensity she applied to a difficult script analysis. Dissecting me, I watched, frozen. Her head tilted slightly, a microscopic shift that I knew from rehearsals meant she had found a beat she liked. It was the most intimate moment we had ever shared, and I wasn't even part of it. I was just the audience to her discovery of me. Then, the page turned. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. She finished the entry. She didn't close the book. She simply lifted her head and looked into the mirror. Her eyes found mine in the reflection immediately, locking on with a precision that felt like a physical impact. There was no surprise in her gaze, no apology, just a dark, unreadable acknowledgement. She turned around slowly. The air in the room felt heavy, charged like a match hovering over gasoline. She didn't speak. Instead, she pushed off the vanity table and began to walk toward me. My instinct was to step back, to retreat into the hallway and pretend this wasn't happening. But my feet stayed rooted to the floor. She moved with that predator's grace she was famous for, closing the distance until she was standing inside my personal space. She was close enough that the air between us felt shared. I could smell the sharp, medicinal tang of the tea tree oil she used to remove her makeup, layered over the dusty scent of the theater and the faint, metallic smell of adrenaline. She leaned in, moving slowly until her mouth was inches from my ear. I stopped breathing. The proximity was overwhelming, a sudden sensory overload that short-circuited my panic and replaced it with a sharp, electric awareness. "I want her to stop acting," she whispered. She was quoting me. She was speaking the words I had written in secret, giving them a voice, making them real in the space between us. Her voice wasn't mocking. It was low, rough, with a texture I had never heard her use on stage. It sounded like verification. She was checking the data. "And actually look at me," she finished. She pulled back just enough to look me in the eye again. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up, slow and deliberate. A small, crooked smile touched the corner of her lips. Not a smirk, but something secret, something shared. "Your writing," she said softly, "is significantly better than your acting." And then, before I could exhale, before I could form a defense or an apology, she stepped around me and walked out the door, heading toward the stage without looking back. Walking onto the stage felt like stepping onto a different planet. The floorboards were the same, the tape marks for blocking were still peeling in the corner, but the atmosphere had shifted tectonically. Usually, the walk from the dressing room to the wings is a time for me to build my walls, to secure the technical scaffolding of the character. Today, I was walking out with no skin. I was entirely raw nerve. Nadia was already there, standing center stage under the work lights. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't doing her usual vocal warm-ups that sounded like aggressive humming. She was just standing there, waiting, watching me emerge from the shadows with a look that said, "Game on." The director yelled action, and we launched into the argument scene. It was the pivotal moment in Act 2, where our characters, who have been dancing around an affair, finally rip into each other about honesty. For 6 weeks, this scene had been a polite tennis match. I would say my line, she would say hers, and we would miss each other completely. But today, the first line out of her mouth hit me in the chest. She didn't deliver it to the back row. She delivered it to the secret I had just left open on the vanity. "You never say what you mean," she said. The line was in the script, written by a playwright who had been dead for 20 years. But in her mouth, it was brand new. It was an accusation. It was a reference to the journal. She took a step toward me, violating the blocking we had established weeks ago. Usually, she stayed by the window frame. Today, she was hunting. I should have frozen. I should have called for a line check or looked at the stage manager. But I didn't. The adrenaline of the dressing room was still pumping through me, overriding my usual control. I didn't think about my posture or my projection. I just reacted. "I say exactly what is necessary," I shot back. And my voice wasn't the modulated, trained instrument I prided myself on. It was thin, sharp, and terrified. Nadia smiled. She knew she had me. She was testing the hypothesis of my writing. I had written that I wanted her to stop acting. She was giving me exactly that. She was using the text of the play to have the conversation we were too cowardly to have in reality. Every movement she made was a challenge. When she grabbed my wrist, a moment that was usually a limp theatrical gesture, her grip was tight, grounding, warm. She pulled me off balance, physically and emotionally. "Then stop hiding," she growled. Again, the script, but the subtext was screaming. I read it, I know. The scene culminated in a moment of near violence that usually dissolved into awkward blocking. I was supposed to turn away, unable to face her. But as I started the turn, the technical pivot I had practiced 100 times, she stepped into my path. She forced the confrontation. She forced the eye contact I had written about craving. I looked up, breathless, expecting to see the character. I saw Nadia. I saw the dark amusement in her eyes, the challenge, and something else, a heat that radiated off her like a physical wave. "Look at me," she said. The moment stretched, thick with the sudden, undeniable realization that the barrier between us had evaporated. I wasn't acting. I was just standing there, exposed, letting her see exactly what I wanted. "Cut!" The director's voice shattered the moment like a hammer on glass. We broke apart instantly, chests heaving, the air between us vibrating. I couldn't look at the crew. I felt like we had just done something illicit in front of everyone. "That!" the director shouted, scrambling up from his seat in the third row. He looked frantic, delighted. "That is what I'm talking about. The tension, the stakes. Finally, you two are actually in the same room." He was praising the new choices, completely oblivious to the fact that he was watching a private crisis unfold in real time. He thought it was method acting. He didn't know it was blackmail. Or maybe it was a seduction. I wasn't sure anymore. Nadia didn't smile at his praise. She just looked at me, wiped a sheen of sweat from her forehead, and nodded once. Acknowledgement. You survived. The rehearsal ended, but the energy didn't drop. Usually, the moment the lights go down, we retreat to our separate corners. Today, the static clung to us. It followed us as we grabbed our bags, as we walked out the stage door into the alley. It was pouring rain, a sudden city downpour that turned the asphalt into a black mirror. We stood under the awning, the sound of the rain loud and rhythmic, neither of us moving to leave. The air was cold, but I was burning up. "I don't have an umbrella," I said. A stupid, obvious thing to say. "I know," Nadia replied. She wasn't looking at the rain. She was looking at me, her gaze heavy, assessing. "You should probably come with me then." We ended up at a place called The Foundry, a narrow, subterranean bar 3 blocks from the stage door that neither of us had ever visited. It was neutral ground, a demilitarized zone where the rules of the theater didn't apply. The air inside was thick, smelling of roasted coffee, old bourbon, and the damp wool of our coats. We slid into a booth at the very back, the leather cracked and cool against my legs, the amber lighting low enough to blur the edges of the room, but bright enough that I couldn't hide my face. Nadia ordered a whiskey, neat. I ordered a glass of red wine. For the first few minutes, the silence that settled between us was tentative, stripped of the usual hostility. I watched her hands as she unwound the scarf from her neck. Her fingers were long, devoid of rings, and there was a smear of ink on her thumb, a detail I had never been close enough to notice before. It made her look less like a rival and more like a person who, like me, spent too much time living inside her own head. "I write too," she said suddenly, breaking the quiet. She didn't look at me. She was watching the amber liquid in her glass as she swirled it. Not lists, mostly poetry. Bad poetry, about leaving places. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, battered moleskin, placing it on the table between us, like a peace offering. It was tattered, the elastic band stretched out, a mirror image of my own hidden journal. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. For 6 weeks, I had assumed her confidence was impenetrable, that she moved through the world with no need for an outlet because she simply took what she wanted. "I write about displacement," she continued, her voice dropping into that lower, more intimate register she had used in the dressing room. "About how loud I have to be to make sure I'm not erased. You write to let the pressure out. I write to keep the noise from drowning me." We spent the next hour dismantling the architecture of our rivalry. We talked about the cultural weight we both carried, my need for control versus her need for loud, visceral expression. We were 2 sides of the same coin, navigating a space that demanded we perform our trauma for applause while keeping our actual desires hidden in the wings. Nadia set her glass down, the heavy thud echoing slightly. She leaned forward, crossing her arms. "There was another entry," she said softly. "The one about the silence?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "Yes, you wrote that you wanted a silence that didn't require a defense strategy," she quoted, her memory of my private thoughts terrifyingly accurate. "What did you mean by that?" I took a breath, deciding in that second to stop protecting myself. "I meant that with you, it always feels like a chess match. Even when we aren't speaking, I feel like I have to keep my guard up to calculate my next move. I want to sit with you and not feel like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. I want a connection that doesn't require me to perform invulnerability." Nadia stared at me for a long moment, her expression softening into something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. She let out a short, dry laugh and shook her head, looking down at her hands. "You know," she said, her voice rough with a sudden, unexpected vulnerability, "for 6 weeks, I thought you hated me." I blinked, stunned. "What?" "I thought your technique, your distance, I thought it was disdain," she admitted, looking back up at me, her eyes dark and candid. "I thought you looked at my process, the messiness, the noise, and saw something amateur. I thought you were judging me. I didn't know you were just terrified of how much you wanted to join me." The confession hung in the air between us, reshaping everything. The Cold War hadn't been about hate. It had been about a profound misunderstanding of our own desires. I realized then that the forbidden aspect of our dynamic was a fiction I had written, a genre I had imposed on a story that was actually about two people, desperate to be seen by the only other person in the room who understood the language. "I never hated you," I whispered, the truth of it feeling like a surrender. "I know," Nadia said, reaching across the table. Her hand didn't take mine, but her fingers brushed against my wrist, a light, grounding touch that sent a jolt of electricity straight up my arm. "I know that now." The following week, the lines I had scratched out in frustration began to manifest in the physical world, not as reenactments, but as organic, inescapable impulses. I had written about wanting her to drop her guard. Tuesday afternoon, during a tedious lighting check, she simply sat down next to me on the edge of the stage, her legs dangling into the dark orchestra pit. She didn't check her phone or study her script. She just leaned her shoulder against mine. No words, no performance, just the solid, warm weight of her exhaustion resting against me. It was a small gesture, tectonic in its implication. I froze for a second, instinct telling me to stiffen, to hold the line. But then I exhaled, letting my own weight settle against hers. We sat there for 20 minutes in the semi-darkness, breathing in the same rhythm, anchored by the simple contact of our arms. Then there was the collar. Wednesday, mid-scene, my blouse had bunched up under my blazer. The old Nadia would have ignored it or used it to mock my dishevelment. This Nadia stopped the scene. She didn't ask for permission, she just stepped into my space, her eyes dark and focused, and reached out. Her knuckles grazed the sensitive skin of my throat, a touch so light it felt like a burn. She smoothed the fabric, her fingers lingering for a second too long on the lapel, her gaze holding mine. The air in the room went thin. "Better," she murmured, and the single word carried more intimacy than the entire second act. The theater itself seemed to conspire with us. The dust motes didn't look like grime anymore. They looked like atmosphere, a soft focus filter over our private world. We started exchanging notebooks openly. It became a ritual. During breaks, instead of retreating to our corners, we swapped leather-bound confessions. I read her poetry, jagged, beautiful verses about the ache of being nowhere and everywhere, and she read my prose. We left notes in the margins. I would find her distinct, sharp handwriting next to a paragraph about fear. "You're wrong here. You're not hiding. You're waiting." It wasn't editing. It was courtship conducted in blue ink. The intimacy remained strictly non-sexual, which somehow made it infinitely more dangerous. If we had just slept together, the tension might have broken, dissolved into something manageable and mundane. But we didn't touch. Not like that. We existed in the charge of the almost. It was the hand hovering over the small of my back as we walked through a door, heat radiating through the fabric of my shirt. It was the way she stood directly behind me at the coffee station, close enough that I could feel the rise and fall of her breath. Close enough that if I leaned back 1 inch, I would be in her arms. It was a choreography of restraint. We were mapping the boundaries of a new country, testing how close we could get before the gravity became too strong to resist. I realized, watching her laugh at something I said, a real laugh, head thrown back, throat exposed, that I had misdiagnosed the rivalry completely. It wasn't hate. It was never hate. It was the friction of two people trying to occupy the same emotional space without touching. We were two stars in a binary orbit, drawn to the collision, but unable to pull away. The space between us was heavy with the promise of what would happen when we finally stopped resisting. As opening night loomed, closing in on us with the inevitability of a storm front, the beautiful, fragile bubble we had created began to wobble. The reality of the premiere, the critics, the audience, the sheer weight of expectation started to seep into the theater. The doubt didn't start on stage. It started in the lobby, 2 nights before the opening, during a mandatory donor mixer. I was standing by a potted fern, clutching a glass of lukewarm white wine, trying to make myself invisible. Then I saw her. Nadia was across the room, surrounded by a cluster of producers and wealthy patrons. She was radiant. She was charming. She was performing. I watched as she laughed at a joke that wasn't funny, her head thrown back in a gesture that looked identical to the one I had cherished in the rehearsal room just days before. She touched the arm of a potential donor with the same casual, electric intimacy she had used to fix my collar. It was a masterclass in social manipulation, a dazzling display of the mask she wore to survive. But instead of seeing it for what it was, a necessary shield, I felt a cold, sharp spike of terror in my gut. If she could fake that warmth so perfectly for a stranger, how could I be sure she wasn't faking it with me? Was the intimacy in the wings just another method acting exercise? The thought was a parasite. Once it burrowed in, it began to eat everything. I felt foolish, exposed. I cornered her later, back in the safety of the shadows backstage. She was wiping the donor smile off her face, looking tired and unguarded, ready to drop the act with me. But I didn't let her. "We need to pull back," I said, my voice tight, clipped, professional. It was the voice I used to use before the list. Nadia paused, her hand halfway to her scarf. She turned slowly, her brow furrowing. "What?" Whatever this is," I gestured vaguely between us, refusing to name it. "It's getting messy. It's bleeding into the work too much. I was watching you out there and I realized we're losing perspective. We need to focus on the technicals for the opening. We need boundaries." It was a cowardly speech, but I delivered it with the precision of a surgeon. I watched the light go out of her eyes. It was a slow, quiet dimming. She searched for the person who had sat with her in the orchestra pit. She didn't find her. Nadia didn't fight. She didn't argue or try to explain that the donor party was just a job. She simply straightened her spine, the vulnerability vanishing behind a wall of perfect, icy politeness. She put the armor back on, piece by heavy piece. "Understood," she said. Her voice was flat, void of any texture. "You're right. Professionalism first." She walked away, and the distance she left in her wake was absolute. The next day, the dress rehearsal was a disaster. Not technically. Technically, it was flawless. We hit every mark, we projected to the back row, but the room was dead. The electric charge that had made the director weep with joy was gone, replaced by a hollow, mechanical efficiency. We were strangers again, 2 actresses reciting lines in a cold room. I reached for her in the argument scene, and her arm was hard, unyielding. She looked at me, but she didn't see me. The connection was severed, and the play, which had relied entirely on the truth of our hidden bond, collapsed into a well-rehearsed lie. I had regained my control, but I had killed the art. Opening night is a specific kind of violence. The air in the backstage corridor was thick with the scent of lilies. Why do people always send funeral flowers for a birth? Mixed with the chemical sting of maximum hold hairspray and the nervous, acidic sweat of 20 people cramming into a hallway too narrow for their egos. It was supposed to be a celebration, the culmination of 6 weeks of blood and dust, but to me, it felt like a wake. The noise from the house was a dull, oceanic roar, the sound of 500 people waiting to judge us. But inside the dressing room, the silence was absolute. We were back where we started, sitting at the shared vanity. But the atmosphere had curdled. It was dead air, brittle, as if a single wrong move would bring the ceiling down. I watched her in the glass. She was applying her eyeliner with surgical precision, her face a mask of impenetrable focus. She had listened to me. She was the professional. And I hated it. I realized with a sickening lurch that I couldn't go out there and perform this play with a stranger. The characters we were playing needed the blood we shared. Without the reality of our connection, they were just words on a page, hollow and convincing no one. I looked at my notebook, sitting closed on the corner of the desk. The source of the trouble. The source of the truth. I didn't let myself think. I grabbed the pen, flipped to a fresh page, past the lists, past the confessions, and wrote. My hand shook, making the letters jagged and urgent, stripping away the elegance of my usual script. I lied, I wrote, the ink digging into the paper. I'm not afraid of the work suffering. I'm afraid that this is just a role for you, and that when the curtain comes down, you'll stop looking at me. But I would rather ruin the play than pretend I don't want you to look. I didn't close the book this time. I didn't hide it. I slid it across the white laminate, the leather cover making a soft hissing sound that cut through the dead air of the room. It stopped inches from her elbow. Nadia froze. Her hand hovered over her makeup kit, a brush suspended in midair. She looked at the book, then at my reflection. I didn't look away. I held her gaze, stripping away the apology, the panic, the professional veneer I used as a shield. I just waited. She set down the brush. Slowly, deliberately, she looked down at the page. I watched her eyes track the words. I watched for the flinch, the scoff, the rejection. Instead, her jaw tightened. The muscle feathered there, a tiny, human betrayal of her composure. She read it twice. Then, without a word, she reached into her bag, pulled out a pen, and scribbled something underneath my entry. She slid the book back. I looked down. In her sharp, angular script, she had written one word. Never. Places! The stage manager whispered urgently from the doorway, his voice cracking with stress. We stood up in unison. The walk to the wings felt like marching into battle. But the air had changed. The oxygen had returned to the building. We stood in the pitch-black darkness of stage left, the audience sound swelling on the other side of the velvet curtain. My heart was in my throat, beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't see her face in the dark, but I could feel her. The heat of her body was a compass point in the void. Just as the cue light turned from red to blue, the signal to go, I felt her hand find mine in the dark. It wasn't a character choice. It wasn't in the blocking. It was Nadia. She squeezed my fingers, a hard, grounding pressure that traveled all the way up my arm and settled in my chest. It was forgiveness. It was a promise. She held on until the very last second, until the lights surged. And then she let go, stepping into the brightness. I followed her out. And when I looked at her on stage, under the blinding glare of the spots, she wasn't acting. She was looking at me. And for the next 2 hours, we didn't perform. We burned. We tore the script apart and put it back together with the raw material of us. The audience disappeared. The critics vanished. There was only the undeniable gravity of her eyes and the absolute certainty that we were no longer pretending. The curtain call had been a blur of blinding light and a wall of sound that felt physical, pushing against us, a roar of approval for the blood we had just spilled on stage. But the real moment, the one that actually mattered, didn't happen in front of 500 people. It happened in the quiet that followed. The dressing room was empty again, the flowers from the lobby now wilting slightly in the oppressive heat, the air heavy with the cloying scent of lilies, hairspray, and cold cream. We sat at the vanity, the same white laminate strip that had staged our war and our truce, stripping away the layers of the characters we had just inhabited. I watched the process in the mirror. It felt ceremonial. Nadia was wiping away the heavy stage foundation, the aggressive contouring that gave her that sharp, predatory look under the lights. With every swipe of the cotton pad, the mask dissolved. The arrogance was scrubbed away. The performance was peeled back. What remained was just her, pale, exhausted, eyes rimmed with fatigue, and undeniably, terrifyingly present. The silence between us wasn't charged with the static of rivalry anymore. It was comfortable, a soft, worn-in thing like an old velvet coat. "So," she said, her voice rough, stripped of its theatrical projection. She didn't look at me, focusing intently on a stubborn patch of eyeliner on her left lid. The list. My heart gave a small, familiar kick against my ribs, but the sharp edge of fear was gone. "The list," I echoed, watching my own hands as I uncapped a bottle of micellar water. "I was thinking," she continued, dropping the stained makeup wipe into the bin between us. She turned in her chair to face me, the movement slow, deliberate, and entirely unscripted. "We should be systematic about it. You're the technical one, remember? The architect? We should probably start checking things off." I turned to face her, a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth, a reflex I didn't try to hide. "Is that so?" "Mm-hmm." She leaned back, crossing her legs, looking at me with that dark, amused gaze that saw everything I tried to hide. There was an entry near the middle, about an honest conversation. No subtext, no acting, just the truth. "I remember," I said softly. The memory of the ink on the page was still vivid. "Well," she said, and her gaze dropped to my mouth before returning to my eyes. "I'm not acting now. And the truth is, I don't want to go home alone to my empty apartment. And I don't want you to go home alone to yours. And I think we wasted 6 weeks pretending we didn't want to be exactly where we are right now." It wasn't a grand monologue. It wasn't poetry. It was better. It was the honest conversation I had written about wanting, but never believing I would actually get. "That's a good start," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Nadia didn't smile. She just leaned forward, closing the distance between our chairs, and rested her head on my shoulder. It wasn't a sexual gesture, not yet. It was a claiming. It was a surrender. I felt the weight of her, the solid, undeniable reality of her body against mine, and I let my head rest against hers. We stayed like that for a long time, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator in the corner, breathing in the scent of rain and fading adrenaline. We packed up our bags in a synchronized rhythm of zippers and clasps. Then, I watched her take my notebook from the table. She didn't open it. She just placed it on top of hers, stacking them together, mine with the list, hers with the poetry, before sliding them both into her bag. It was a physical merging of our private worlds. We walked out the stage door into the cool, damp night air. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the amber streetlights like a mirror. We didn't hold hands, not yet, but as we walked toward the subway, her knuckles brushed against mine, a promise of everything that was coming next. The rivalry was dead, left behind on the stage floor. What walked out into the city was a complex, co-authored story that was just beginning. If you've ever found love in the place you least expected it, subscribe to follow the rest of this journey.